She barely qualifies as a Carrington." That's what my mother whispered to my cousin, less than 10 minutes after I walked through the door. No welcome home. No, we've missed you. Just that. They didn't stop me from sitting at the table. They just made sure the only chair left was half in shadow, by the column. And when my name never came up during the will reading, my father looked me in the eye and said, "Maybe this is a lesson, Juliet." I didn't argue. I just sat there, listening to who got the summer house, the stocks, the antique ring I used to sketch as a child. But here's the thing. I wasn't forgotten. I was prepared by the only person who ever saw me as more than a placeholder. And when his last letter arrived, sealed in wax, meant only for me, I finally understood why he left me the one thing they all wanted. Not the estate, the truth. If you've ever sat in a room full of family and felt like a stranger, drop a comment number 1. If not, you're one of the lucky ones. Drop a number 0. Because sometimes being left out isn't the end of the story. It's where it finally begins. They didn't say I couldn't sit at the table. They just made sure the only chair left was by the column, half in shadow. I paused just long enough for everyone to notice I was pausing, then sat. The wood of the chair groaned softly beneath me, the same groan it gave when I was 16 and stormed out mid-dinner after announcing I'd gotten into RISD and would not, in fact, be majoring in economics. My father had cleared his throat. My mother had refolded her napkin. Paul laughed. The chair was still there. I don't know if that was meant to be generous or cruel. The Carrington estate had a way of making even warmth feel chilly. The drawing room looked curated more than decorated, like a museum that only pretended people lived in it. The mahogany sideboard gleamed under the weight of antique decanters no one drank from. The fireplace crackled in a disciplined, symmetrical way. There was heat in the room, technically, but it didn't reach the places that mattered. I ran my fingers along the edge of the chair, brushing the tiny notch where I'd carved my initials, J.M.C., when I was a child. Juliet Margaret Carrington. I remember the guilt I felt when the blade slipped, when the wood splintered slightly deeper than I meant. Margot made me scrub it with lemon oil for an hour, though I don't think she really cared about the chair. She cared about the idea of damage, the appearance of something being spoiled. I looked around. Nothing else in the room remembered me. Mr. Reeves sat silently in the corner, a ghost with a briefcase. His posture was meticulous, too still to be comfortable, and he held his folder like it might bite. I recognized him from the funeral. He hadn't said a word then, either. Margot, perfectly composed, was seated closest to the fireplace. She wore navy and pearls, her usual armor. Her lipstick was the same shade she wore when I was 12. Back then, I thought it was elegant. Now, it felt like she hadn't allowed herself to change a single thing in a decade, as if age was a rumor she refused to believe. Paul lounged sideways on the settee, thumbing through his phone, legs spread carelessly like he owned the floor beneath him. He caught me looking and smirked without lifting his eyes. "Didn't think you'd actually show," he muttered, not loud enough to be reprimanded, but loud enough for me to hear. "Hello to you too, Paul," I said. No one else spoke. Elise swirled her wine and said something about how the euro was sliding again, making Prague an ideal timeshare market. Her nails were red, her teeth too white, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard her say anything without a price tag attached. She'd always been the cousin with perfect posture and an allergy to sincerity. The last time I came home was Christmas, 10 years ago. I'd arrived early, hoping someone might notice. Snow in my boots, duffel in my hand, I'd stood in the front hall for 12 minutes. No one looked up. The holiday music kept playing. Robert had been reading then too, as he was now, as if he could flip the page on my presence and turn me into background noise. Today, the housekeeper had let me in with a nod, said the guest room, my old room, was ready. It wasn't. The air inside was stale and sharp, like paper left too long in a file drawer. My bed was still covered in the same chintz quilt from high school. I found my old art supplies under the bed, pastels dulled with time, a tin of brushes, a folded sketchbook that still smelled faintly of turpentine and dried violets. I hadn't unpacked. I wasn't staying long. Debussy played overhead, some pre-programmed playlist still running on the house system. The notes spiraled in that familiar way. Beautiful, unresolved. It made the silence between us all the more jarring. Mr. Reeve stood slowly, cleared his throat once. Per Mr. Carrington's instruction, he paused, looked around the room as if to make sure we were all real. I looked back at him, waiting for the page to turn, for the beginning of whatever my father had written from beyond his own ending. I glanced at Margot, and just then I saw her lean toward Elise, her lips barely parting. "She barely qualifies as a Carrington," she whispered. She didn't think I'd hear, but I did. The words didn't land like a slap. They landed like a confirmation. Something I'd always suspected, now said aloud, like a verdict on a case I'd stopped defending years ago. I stayed still. My hands were in my lap, but I felt the sting in my knuckles like I'd been the one slapped. Mr. Reeve clears his throat. "Before we begin, Mr. Carrington left an introductory video. Names were called, assets listed, glasses raised. I sat still, waiting for mine. Mr. Reeve's voice moved with the certainty of a train on rails, smooth and deliberate, like he'd practiced this particular cadence many times in front of a mirror. I watched the sunlight land squarely on the silver tray of water glasses, making them look more important than they were. Outside, the winter wind scratched faintly at the leaded panes, but inside, it was all crystal and marble and muted congratulations. To Paul Carrington, Mr. Reeve read, the property on Riverwatch Lane in Savannah, the trust fund previously capped at age 30, now unrestricted, and the vintage Omega watch from Mr. Carrington's personal collection. Paul made a pleased noise low in his throat. "Finally," he said, not bothering to hide his grin. "I already know where I'll put the watch, next to the bar cart in the study." Every word was another nail in the coffin of subtlety. Margot reached over and rested a hand lightly on his arm. Her smile was thin, brittle, but it stayed where it was supposed to. "He always said that watch would come to you, darling." I remember that watch. Grandfather used to wind it every night at 8 p.m., precisely. He said it was the only man-made thing that still respected time. I once asked if I could wear it to a school debate. He smiled like he hadn't heard me. "Elise Carrington," Mr. Reeve continued, "is to receive the jewelry collection stored in the personal safe, excluding the cameo brooch, and a monetary sum to be distributed upon completion of her MBA. Elise clinked her glass softly and murmured something about old diamonds and new beginnings. No one laughed, but no one stopped her either. I kept my gaze on the folder in Mr. Reeve's hands. It was getting lighter with every page. Margot sipped her tea, pinky extended slightly, as if royalty had taught her table manners. She didn't look at me. Robert, on the other hand, did. "There are consequences to decisions," he said quietly, his eyes settling on mine like cold stones. "Maybe this is a lesson, Juliet. Responsibility matters." My fingers curled inside the sleeves of my cardigan. The cashmere itched where the cuffs met the bend of my wrists. I felt the texture more than the words. I stayed quiet. Not because I agreed, Not even because I was hurt. I stayed quiet because if I spoke, I wouldn't stop. He never asked what I'd done with my last decade. He didn't want to know about the murals I painted in the clinic for pediatric oncology. He didn't care that I taught high schoolers how to draw emotion with chalk. He wanted something he could frame and display and claim as his legacy. There was a moment, barely a breath, where I thought Margot might say something. Her eyes flitted to mine, just briefly, but she looked away, chose instead to reach for a biscuit that crumbled the instant she touched it. Mr. Reeve continued. More distributions, property in Hilton Head to a cousin I barely knew. Bonds to an uncle who hadn't been seen since 2003. Elise's sister, Kara, received a sculpture no one liked but was worth an obscene amount. Everyone had something. Names were spoken like benedictions. The room grew quieter each time one was read, as if each gift removed another ounce of air from the space. But mine wasn't called. Not once. Have you ever sat through a moment where your name wasn't called? Not because they forgot, but because they chose to forget? That kind of silence cuts the deepest. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, drop a comment number 8 below. Now let's see what came next. I adjusted the way I sat, folding one leg under the other to stop the trembling. I felt the edge of the chair dig into my calf. The same one from yesterday, my initials still there, mostly forgotten, still present. The last time I made place cards for Thanksgiving, I was 9. I used gold ink and pressed leaves from the garden. Everyone's name was carefully written, but mine never made it to the table. I found it later in the trash, with a gravy stain. Margot had told me it was an oversight, that the table was too full, that I could sit wherever. Even then, I understood that wherever meant out of the way. Mr. Reeve paused. "There is an addendum," he said. He reached into the briefcase again, this time retrieving a second envelope, thicker, hand-sealed. It looked newer than the other documents, as though it had been touched more recently. His hands held it differently too, less like paper, more like a message. Paul chuckled. "Let me guess. Grandfather's speech on tradition?" He leaned back in his chair, satisfied, smug. Next comes the lecture on grit and stock portfolios. Mr. Reeve looked at him for the first time all morning. His expression didn't change, but his words came slower now, weightier. "Number it's addressed to you all, personally." His face appeared on screen before anyone could prepare their polite smiles. The monitor flickered once, blue then black, before settling into a steady image. Grandfather's face filled the room like he never left it. The lines on his forehead were deeper than I remembered, and his mouth carried that familiar set of weariness and command. He was seated in the old leather chair from his study, books lined up behind him like witnesses. I stopped breathing for a second. Margot placed her wine glass down with exacting care. Paul adjusted his collar. Elise leaned forward just enough to suggest interest. Robert, ever composed, crossed his arms like a verdict. "I assume you're all seated," Grandfather began. His voice wasn't frail, wasn't indulgent. It was the voice of a man who'd made decisions too large for apology. "If truth is hard to swallow," he said, echoing the memory that had lived in me since I was 12. "Serve it with silence. They'll taste it anyway." No one moved. I recorded this because I knew the moment I died, certain things would be packaged, spun, minimized. We are, after all, Carringtons. We curate our stories the way we curate art. Framed, staged, lit from the right angle. A pause. He let the silence sit between us like a second presence. "But legacy isn't curation, it's consequence." Paul shifted, the creaky chair groaning beneath him. No one looked his way. I watched many of you choose comfort over courage, grandfather continued. Lies, indifference, cowardice disguised as strategy. Elise, your silence when you knew the accounting was wrong. Robert, your willingness to write off an employee's lawsuit as a cost of doing business. Margot, your need to preserve face at the cost of honesty. Margot's fingers tensed around the armrest. She didn't speak. She didn't deny. And Paul, grandfather said, his tone flat, final. You were never taught the value of something earned. I gave you a chance to grow up. You gave me an invoice for renovations. Paul's mouth fell open. That's enough. Grandfather's hand, even on screen, lifted with quiet authority. This is not a tribunal. I'm not here for confession. I'm here to clarify one final thing. I felt myself tilt forward slightly. My heart had found a rhythm somewhere between dread and disbelief. There is one among you, he said, who never asked for the spotlight, who never fought for the inheritance, who never treated my name like currency. She simply stayed, not physically, but in principle. He looked straight into the camera, as if the lens could carry his eyes to mine. She gets it now. A slow inhale, a long exhale. To Juliet Carrington, I leave the Carrington estate, the charitable foundation, and full administrative authority over its governance. Effective immediately. The room didn't explode. It simply imploded. For a moment, there was only the fire crackling, too decorative to offer heat. Then the sound of glass breaking, Margot's hand trembling just enough to send the rim of her goblet against the brass tray. Robert didn't move, but his jaw set into stone. Paul stood up, fists clenched, ready for a stage no one had built for him. That's insane, he snapped. She's barely been here. No one replied. I didn't turn to look at them. I watched the screen. Grandfather blinked once. He looked older now, tired. You all asked me what legacy meant, he said, softer now. I couldn't define it then, but I'll try now. A beat passed. Legacy isn't what you leave. It's what you protect from being erased. The screen went black. No music, no signature, no fade out, just black. I sat still. The edges of my vision felt too sharp. The chair under me had never felt so small. The initials I'd once carved into its wooden armrest pressed against my finger like they'd waited for this. Years ago, I found a folded note inside my sketchbook. A page grandfather must have slipped in without telling me. All it said was, "Build the quiet thing." I didn't know what he meant. I thought he was talking about art, about the process. But now, sitting in a room full of people who had only ever spoken in performances, I understood. They spoke. I built silence. Elise whispered, "Can we contest this?" Mr. Reeves stepped forward. His voice didn't rise, but it ended the question before it began. Number, it's binding, and it's already in effect. They asked to meet in the conservatory, like it was some kind of negotiation. It felt more like a funeral for their expectations. The conservatory had always struck me as a place designed more for show than comfort, an elegant glass cage where even the plants seemed reluctant to thrive. Morning light filtered through misted panes, casting watery shadows across the polished stone floor. Someone had arranged a tea set at the center of the long glass table, but nothing was touched. The silver gleamed too deliberately. The lemon slices were drying out at the edges. I paused a moment at the entrance, taking in the tableau. Robert sat ramrod straight at the far end, hands clasped, suit crisp. Margot was beside him, her pearls too perfect, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her untouched cup. Paul slouched in his chair, jaw tight, foot tapping an angry rhythm. Elise, ever the moderator, wore a smile soft enough to hide the calculation behind it. No one rose when I entered. The empty chair was obvious, pulled just far enough from the table to require me to claim it. I did. "Juliet," Margot said with the smile she used at charity events. "We appreciate you coming. We thought it would be constructive to speak privately." Her tone was like her perfume, faint, expensive, and entirely impersonal. "We wanted to discuss how to move forward," Robert added. "Now that the terms of the will are public," Paul snorted. "Terms? More like a betrayal." Elise cleared her throat. "This isn't about denying your position. It's about coordinating, transitioning responsibly." I looked down at the tea. Earl Grey, grandfather's favorite. I'd never seen Margot drink it. "Let's be honest," I said. "This isn't coordination, it's containment." Paul slammed his hand against the table. "You don't get it. You were never around. You didn't help build this family's name." "You mean polish its image?" I asked. "Because that's what this has always been about. How things appear." Robert slid a folder toward me. "We drafted a proposal. You retain ceremonial oversight. We handle operations." "You mean you handle the power?" I said, not bothering to open it. "It's a win-win," Elise offered. "Your name stays prominent. You're protected from the scrutiny." I pulled a document from my own folder, lighter but far heavier in consequence. Grandfather appointed me interim CEO 6 months ago through a private consultancy. I've already been making decisions, financial ones, public ones. Have you ever been told you didn't belong, only to realize you were already holding the reins? That moment when silence turns into strength. If you've ever surprised them with who you've become, drop a comment number 9 below. Let's see what she does next. The pause that followed wasn't shock. It was adjustment. They weren't surprised, only unprepared to admit he hadn't trusted them. "You're bluffing," Paul muttered. "Check the filings," I said. "My name's there, not as Juliet Carrington, as J.M. Easton. The initials he helped me choose when I wanted distance. He gave me that choice. And now, this one." Margot's eyes flickered. "He never said—" "Because he didn't trust you to hear it." My voice was calm, but my heartbeat thundered beneath it. This wasn't just about winning. It was about stepping into the room like I belonged, because I always had, even if no one offered me a seat. Robert's face was unreadable. "You're making a mistake." "No," I said. "I'm correcting one." Elise folded her hands, still serene. "The optics will be difficult. Public perception is delicate." "You've all been delicate for too long," I replied. "So careful not to say what you mean. Grandfather didn't want silence anymore." Paul stood up abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "You think you're better than us?" "No," I said, "but I think I listened better." I turned to Robert. "You always assumed I was the mistake, but I was the contingency." The words hung between us like frost in the air. Margot blinked rapidly. Paul muttered something under his breath I didn't bother to catch. That's when I noticed the figure behind the frosted glass. Uncle Raymond, standing motionless beyond the door. He didn't knock. He didn't wave. Just watched. A moment later, a soft rap. A folded paper slid under the frame. I stood and walked over, picked it up. It was his handwriting. Careful, precise, library, cedar box, midnight. The envelope was thick, sealed in wax, and unmistakably his. He didn't believe in email, only permanence. It sat on the cedar box like it had always been there, waiting. The rain outside was little more than a whisper against the window panes, but inside the guest bedroom, it felt deafening. A steady tick from the clock near the desk was the only rhythm, the only proof that time still moved forward. I didn't reach for it right away. I sat on the edge of the bed, tracing the stitching in the comforter, noticing the scent, pipe tobacco and lemon oil. I hadn't smelled it in years, not since he passed. The cedar box was his. That much was clear. The kind of wood that resisted age, like him. There was something poetic about that. Uncle Raymond had said nothing when he left it in my care, just nodded once, his eyes lingering a beat too long before stepping back into the hallway. He knew what it meant. Or maybe he knew I would. I ran my finger along the wax seal. His initials. T.E.C. The same way he signed the sketches he kept tucked inside his favorite history books, always in pencil, never ink. Ink is too final, he used to say, but some things deserve finality. I broke the seal. The letter was handwritten, as I expected. His handwriting was crisp, deliberate, with flourishes that made each word feel like a decision. He began with no greeting, just a date, 6 months before he died. And the phrase, "If you're reading this, they've heard my voice and reacted accordingly." That almost made me smile. He went on. "You know better than most the cost of silence. You've paid it. I watched you fold inwards when the table had no seat for you. I watched you bring your sketchbook to the attic because no one asked about your day. I watched, Juliet. Not passively, not indifferently. Quiet is not the same as absence." I paused, my throat tightening. He wrote of how the family had once pressured him to remove me from the line of succession. It was easier, they claimed, less disruptive, clean. He admitted he agreed, once. I folded that day, and I regretted it every hour after. I read on. "You were never supposed to be a showpiece. You were always the blueprint. The future should not be dressed in the costumes of the past." Inside the cedar box, under the letter, was a sketch. My sketch. Crinkled at the corners, but carefully preserved. I recognized the drawing immediately. It was of me, maybe age 7 or 8, painting alone on the porch, barefoot and focused. On the back, in his handwriting, were 4 words. Build the quiet thing. I stared at those words for a long time. I remembered that day. No one had joined me outside. It was summer, and I'd spilled half a bottle of tempera on the wood planks. I thought it would stain forever, but he hadn't been mad. He just brought me a rag and said, "If it leaves a mark, it's because it mattered." The rain picked up a little, tapping harder against the windows now. I leaned back and let the letter rest on my lap. For the first time since returning to this estate, I felt something settle. Not comfort, not closure, but clarity. This wasn't just about legal rights or family assets. This was about being seen. I remembered that Christmas when I was 8, turned away from the dining room, no reason given. I sat on the staircase for what felt like hours. Everyone laughed behind the closed doors. It wasn't until later that night that he appeared beside me, carrying a slice of pecan pie on a paper plate. No words, just pie and presents. He never explained. He never had to. The clock ticked on. I folded the letter, placed it back inside the envelope, and closed the cedar box. My eyes drifted to the worn suitcase near the door, half packed with clothes and uncertainty. I stood, walked over, and unzipped the front pocket. I opened my suitcase and placed the envelope inside, next to an old note. "If they ask who you are, tell them you stayed." 3 months later, I walked into the Carrington boardroom, not to argue, but to begin. The spring light hit the windows at a gentler angle now. Gone was the chill of late fall that once clung to the estate like an old regret. In its place, warmth that crept in slowly, as if testing whether it belonged. Richmond had started blooming. Dogwoods lining the front walk had exploded into whites and pinks. Tulips near the front steps stood in quiet formation. And inside this building, this legacy, I now stood without apology. The Carrington Foundation headquarters hadn't changed much architecturally. Grandfather loved symmetry, marble floors, and moldings thick as wrists. But something else had shifted. Not in the bricks or banisters, but in the current. How people moved, how they greeted one another in the halls. There was less stiffness, less sense of peering through glass to speak. Doors were ajar more often now, and when they saw me, they nodded, not with suspicion, but with something like trust. My office was modest by comparison to the one my father used to keep. Pale gray walls, an old wood desk I'd refinished myself. One watercolor on the wall, a marsh I'd painted in college. The sky in it was all ochre and possibility. A blue scarf draped across the chair, frayed at the ends but familiar. My laptop, a stack of board reports, and a ceramic mug from a staff member that read, "Quiet is a strength." On my first day, I'd removed the plaque from the door. It had read, Chairwoman Juliet Carrington. I didn't need a title to do the work. I just needed the work to mean something. I met each staff member face to face over those first weeks. No memos, no hierarchy games. I sat in the break room with janitors, analysts, receptionists. I asked what worked and what didn't, what they needed that they'd stopped asking for. Most were surprised. Some were skeptical. But I listened. And slowly, the stories poured out. So we doubled base pay. We brought back the whistleblower protections. We removed 5 board members who hadn't attended meetings in years, but continued to draw bonuses. And that executive dining room, the one with the walnut panels and rare wine cabinet, I had it stripped bare. In its place now, a community art gallery. Each month, a new rotation of local artists filled the walls. No velvet ropes, no exclusivity, just art, people. At the last opening, an 8-year-old boy pointed at a canvas and said, "That looks like Grandma's backyard." I stood behind him, anonymous, content. One of my pieces was there too, unsigned, like all the rest. It didn't matter if anyone knew. It had never been about that. One afternoon, a holiday envelope arrived in my inbox. No handwriting, just the Carrington family card. The same glossy photo, Margot in her cranberry turtleneck, Robert in navy, Paul and Elise flanking them like expensive statues. The fireplace roared politely behind them. No note inside, no greeting. I looked at it for a long time. Then I turned it over and wrote, in small, even script, "I was there." I sealed it and sent it back. No return address, no explanation, just a quiet correction. Later that week, I unlocked the old studio. It still smelled of pipe tobacco and linseed oil. Dust clung to the corners, but I hadn't allowed the cleaners to touch anything else. The easel in the far corner still held the canvas my grandfather had left unfinished. A soft twilight portrait of the estate from the west. It was familiar, yet incomplete. The brush rested in a small jar, long since dried. For weeks, I'd left it as it was. Sacred, untouched. But that afternoon, I approached it without fear. I dipped a clean brush into diluted white, added a trace of gray. Then, in the sky he'd never finished, I painted a single egret in flight, wings mid-arc, trailing motion behind it. Quiet but sure. It didn't change the whole painting. It just gave it direction. I stepped back and let the stillness settle. Then I whispered, "That's enough." Sometimes I still pass the old estate in my thoughts, quiet and grand, as if waiting for an apology it no longer needs. The echo of what was never said lingers softer now, less like accusation, more like memory. I've come to believe that legacy isn't a monument, but a daily choice to protect what matters, even when no one is watching. Families are rarely fair, but they are often honest in their own imperfect ways. If this story met something inside you, maybe sit with it a moment. See what quiet truths might surface in your own.